Daniel adjusted his tie and checked his reflection in the elevator's polished doors. It was another day at work, another day of crunching the numbers. Each ping brought him closer to the 14th floor and Mr. Bennett's domain. As he stepped out of the usual cacophony of ringing phones and clacking keyboards, he nodded. Some of his colleagues had tired smiles, which mirrored his own. He'd been at Pinnacle Corporation for 8 years and wondered what he had to show for it. He had a cubicle with a dying plant and a framed photo of Laura, his wife. Her smiling face was a reminder of simpler times. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was good. Theirs, he thought. Chambers. Mr. Bennett's voice boomed across the office. My office now. Daniel suppressed a sigh, straightening his shoulders as he approached the corner office. Through the glass walls, he could see Mr. Bennett's imposing figure, phone pressed to his ear. Sir Daniel, he said, stepping inside Bennett's office. He held up a finger, making it clear that his conversation was more important than the man he'd just summoned. Daniel stood there, feeling like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. Finally, Bennett hung up. The Henderson account, Chambers, what's the latest on that? I submitted the proposal yesterday. I'm just waiting on legal. Not good enough, Bennett said, leaning back in his leather chair. I need it done by tomorrow. Make it happen. But sir, legal said they need at least. Chambers' eyes narrowed. Should I find someone else who can handle it? No, Bennett said. I need it done by tomorrow. Get it done, Daniel swallowed. No way, I'll get it done, Bennett smirked. Oh, and don't forget the company party tonight. You're going, right? Daniel nodded, already dreading another evening of forced smiles and small talk as he turned to leave. Bennett added, Bring that lovely wife of yours. What's her name again? Lisa Laura. Daniel corrected, Laura. He gave a little snort of annoyance. Laura, don't forget. Back at his desk, Daniel sent a quick text to Laura. Company party tonight, Bennett says you're coming. Her reply came moments later. Fine, pick me up at 7. The rest of the day passed in a blur of frantic calls and emails. By some miracle, Daniel got through it all. He managed to push the Henderson proposal through, but it came at a cost. The legal team was furious and he knew he'd burned some bridges there. As he loosened his tie in the car, Laura touched up her lipstick in the passenger mirror. You look exhausted, she commented. You must have had a long day, replied Daniel, pulling into the hotel parking lot. Ben's been on, she added. My case. Laura's hand found his knee. Maybe tonight's your chance to impress him. Who knows, it could lead to that promotion you've been after. Daniel managed a weak smile. If only it were that simple. The ballroom was already buzzing when they arrived. Clusters of colleagues chatted over drinks. Their laughter was a bit too loud. Loud and a bit too forced, Daniel grabbed 2 glasses of champagne from a passing waiter, handing one to Laura. There you are, Mr. Bennett's voice cut through the noise. He approached, drinking from one hand and draping the other possessively around a young blonde Daniel recognized from HR. This must be the lovely Laura Bennett, he continued, his eyes raking over her in a way that made Daniel's jaw clench. Charm Laura smiled politely and said, Nice to meet you, Mr. Bennett. Daniel told me so much about you. All good things, I hope. Bennett chuckled and winked at Daniel. Chambers. Before Daniel could respond, Bennett clapped his hands together. Let's have hands together, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention, please. The room quietened, and all eyes turned to the CEO. Daniel felt a knot forming in his stomach. Something was off. First, I want to thank you all for coming tonight, Bennett began. It's been a hell of a year, and each of you has played a part in our success. There was a bit of applause. Lo Bennett held up his hand, but tonight I want to talk about something else, something more personal. He looked around the room, and then he looked at Daniel and Laura. He said, In business as in life, everything comes with a price. The question is, how much are you willing to pay for what you want? The room was suddenly very quiet. Daniel could feel Laura tensing up next to him. Bennett was talking about him, saying he was a hard-working guy who was always reliable. But Daniel knew that he'd been stuck in the same position for about 5 years now. He felt his cheeks burning as he wanted to object and defend himself, but he couldn't find the words. Come on, Daniel. Bennett's smile was predatory. I'm here to offer you a deal, a chance to move up the ladder. All it'll cost you is 1 weekend. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Daniel's mind raced. What was Bennett playing at? 1 weekend? Bennett repeated, during which your lovely wife Laura here in return You get job security, a hefty bonus, and a clear path to that corner office you've been after." The room exploded in shocked gasps and whispers. Daniel felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. He turned to Laura, expecting to see horror, disgust, anything but calm consideration. "Laura," he choked. Out she met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, to his utter disbelief, she turned to Bennett and said, "I accept." The room seemed to drop out from under Daniel. It spun. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some sick joke. A test. Anything but reality. But as he looked from Laura's determined face to Ben, he knew it was real. His wife had just agreed to sleep with his boss in front of everyone without a moment's hesitation. It was real. Daniel was angry. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand answers. But as the shocked faces of his colleagues turned to him, he felt pity and morbid curiosity. Daniel's curiosity was evident in his eyes. He did the only thing he could think of. He ran out of the ballroom through the lobby into the cool night air. He took a deep breath to clear his head and make sense of what had just happened, but there was no sense to be made. His entire world had just imploded in the span of 5 minutes. As he stood there, catching his breath, he suddenly realized that this wasn't just about tonight. It was about years of subtle power plays and cross lines, and he'd let it happen, thinking he could play the game and climb the ladder. No more. Daniel straightened his hands, clenching them into fists. They thought he was weak, that he'd just accept this humiliation. They had no idea what they'd unleashed. As he hailed a cab, his mind was already racing, formulating a plan. Bennett and Laura might think they'd won, but Daniel knew better. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He was done. They both learned the true cost of betrayal. Daniel sat in his darkened living room, the clock on the mantelpiece the only sound, breaking the silence. He'd been there for hours, replaying the night's events in his mind, each recollection stoking the fire of his anger. The front door. The door opened and footsteps approached Daniel. Laura's voice was soft. "Are you here?" Daniel didn't respond. He watched as she stepped into view. Her party dress was rumpled, her makeup smudged. She jumped when she saw him sitting there. "Jesus, you scared me," she said, flicking on a lamp. "Why are you sitting in the dark, Daniel?" Laura flinched as if he'd slapped her. "That's not fair. You don't understand." "Then explain it to me." Daniel cut in, rising to his feet. "Explain how my wife of 7 years could agree to sleep with another man without even..." He paused, unsure of how to proceed. "I did it for us," Laura shot back, her own anger evident. "Do you think I want to do this? You've been stuck in the same position for years, always complaining, but never doing anything about it. This is our chance to get ahead." Daniel laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "There is no us anymore." "Laura, you..." Daniel made it clear tonight that he was upset. Laura's eyes welled up with tears. "Please, Daniel. We can work through this. It's just one weekend. Get out of my house." Daniel repeated, "Get out." His voice was calm, but there was a deadly calm about it. "Pack a bag and leave. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here." Laura stared at him, shock written across her face. "You can't," Daniel said. "This is my house too. I paid for it. Get out before I throw you out myself," he added. For a moment, it looked like Laura might argue further, but something in Daniel's eyes must have put her off. Without another word, she turned and headed upstairs. Daniel listened to her movements, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the zipping of a suitcase when she came back down. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "This isn't over," she said, pausing at the door. "We need to talk about this." Daniel didn't respond, didn't even look at her after a moment. Laura left, and the door clicked shut behind her. Only then did Daniel allow himself to slump back into his chair, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on him. As he sat there staring at the framed photos of happier times, a plan began to form in his mind. The next morning, Daniel called in sick to work. He spent the day researching, making calls, and preparing. By the time evening came around, he was ready. His phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "We need to talk. Meet me at Café Blue at 7. Daniel considered ignoring it, but replied anyway. "Fine." The cafe was bustling when he arrived. He spotted Laura at a corner table, nervously fidgeting with her napkin as he approached. She looked up, hope flashing in her eyes. "I'm so glad you came," she said, her face brightening. "I know you're angry, but please let me explain. Or save it, Daniel." "I'm not here to listen to your excuses," he replied, cutting her off. "I'm here to tell you how this is going to go." Laura blinked, taken aback by his tone. "What do you mean?" "I'll tell you what I mean. Daniel replied, leaning forward. His voice was low and intense as he said, "I'm going along with this little arrangement of yours and Bennett's. You said last night that I should do this, didn't you, Laura?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "But I've had time to think, and I'm starting to see the potential here. This could be a big opportunity for me and for us." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue, but he forced himself to continue. "I was just shocked last night, but I've come around." Laura's relief was palpable. "Oh, Daniel, I'm so glad you understand. I promise it's just this one time. Then let's not get ahead of ourselves." "The details with Bennett yet?" Lauren nodded, pulling out her phone. "He'd booked us a suite at the Grandview Hotel. We're supposed to meet him there on Friday evening." Daniel made a show of noting down the information. He was perfect. "Laura," he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'm sorry about last night. I overreacted." Laura gave his hand a reassuring squeeze, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's okay. I'm just surprised we're okay. I love you, Daniel." It took every ounce of willpower for Daniel to smile back and say, "I love you too," as he left the cafe. Daniel's mask of reconciliation fell away, replaced by grim determination. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. Now for Phase 2. The next day at work, Daniel made sure to run into Bennett in the break room. The older man gave him a knowing look. "Chambers, I see you're feeling better after your dramatic exit the other night. I wanted to apologize. It was just a shock, you know, but I've had time to think." "And well, I'm on board," Bennett said, eyebrows raised. "Is that so? And what does the lovely Laura think about your change of heart?" "She's relieved." "Daniel, you lied smoothly. We both are. This could be a great opportunity for all of us." A slow, predatory grin spread across Bennett's face. "I'm glad you've come to your senses, Chambers. I think." Daniel nodded, fighting the urge to punch his boss's smug face. He was sure he'd find this arrangement mutually beneficial. "I'm sure I will," he said. "Laura mentioned you've booked a suite at the Grandview for this weekend," Bennett confirmed. "I assumed she filled you in on the details," Daniel said. "I was wanted," he added, "to see if there was anything else I needed to know, like any preferences or requests you might have." Bennett chuckled, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. He seemed eager to please. "Don't worry, Chambers. I'll take good care of your wife. You just focus on that Henderson account, and I'll handle the rest." It took every ounce of self-control not to recoil from Bennett's touch. Daniel had to fight the urge to recoil from Bennett's touch. Instead, he forced another smile. "Of course, sir. I'll get right on it," he said as he walked away. Daniel's mind was racing. He had the information he needed, and now was time to put his plan into action that evening. Daniel visited an electronics store and purchased He picked up a hidden camera and voice recorder. The sales clerk gave him a curious look as he checked out, but Daniel ignored it. He had bigger concerns back at home. Daniel set up the equipment carefully, testing it to ensure everything was working properly. As he did so, his phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "Packed for thee." Daniel replied that everything was still good for the weekend. He was a little nervous as Friday evening arrived all too quickly. He watched from his car across the street as Laura entered the Grandview Hotel with her rolling suitcase. 10 minutes later, Bennett pulled up in his flashy sports car, looking like the cat that got the cream. Daniel was inside, and he made his move. He managed to persuade the front desk to give him a key to the room next door to Bennett's suite, saying he was planning a surprise for his wife's birthday. As he slipped into the adjoining room, Daniel felt a mix of anticipation and dread. He set up his equipment carefully, positioning the camera to cap. He was in the adjoining suite next door. He put on the headphones connected to the audio recorder for the next hour. Daniel listened and watched. His stomach was churning as Bennett and Laura arrived. Drinks were poured and conversation flowed. Daniel heard Bennett's boastful voice recounting past conquests and business triumphs. He saw Laura Bennett's voice came through the headphones, slightly slurred from alcohol. "I've had my eye on you for a while now. I always wondered what you saw in a pushover like Chambers." Laura's laugh sounded strained. "Daniel's a good man." "Good, sure." Bennett scoffed. "But is he exciting? Does he make you feel?" Laura was on the couch, and Daniel watched as Bennett moved closer to her. His hand came to rest on her knee. "I could show you things Daniel never could," Bennett murmured. "I could give you pleasures you've only dreamed of." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms. He forced himself to keep watching, to keep listening. Listening, he needed this evidence. though he was surprised and disgusted. Laura didn't pull away, she leaned in. Her voice dropped to a sultry whisper. "Why don't you show me?" Then came a blur of clothing being shed, grunts and moans that made Daniel want to rip the headphones off and smash the camera. But he endured it, recording every detail. As the night went on, Daniel's resolve only grew stronger. He'd known intellectually what he was signing up for when he decided to gather this evidence, but experiencing it, hearing Laura's breathless cries and Bennett's grunting, was a whole other matter. At one point during a lull in the action, Daniel heard Bennett's voice again, smug and self-satisfied. He said, "This little arrangement doesn't have to be a one-time thing. I could make things very comfortable for you and Daniel if you're amenable." Laura's response was muffled, but her giggle told Daniel all he needed to know, his wife, soon-to-be ex. By the time morning came, Daniel felt hollowed out, emptied of everything but a cold, hard determination. He'd gotten what he came for, irrefutable evidence of both Laura's infidelity and Bennett's abuse of power. As he packed up his equipment, Daniel could hear Laura and Bennett stirring in the next room. They were discussing breakfast plans as if they hadn't just destroyed a marriage and corrupted a workplace. Daniel slipped out of the hotel. He didn't notice the weight of the camera and recorder in his bag. It was nothing compared to the weight in his chest, but as he drove home, that weight began to transform. It hardened into a shield of resolve. They thought they'd won. They thought Daniel was weak and easily manipulated, but they had no idea what was coming. As he pulled into his driveway, Daniel allowed himself a small, grim smile. The weekend wasn't over yet, and neither was he. Monday morning arrived with a sense of foreboding. Daniel stood in front of his bedroom mirror. The man in the mirror looked different somehow. He looked older and harder. His eyes glinted with cold determination. He grabbed his phone and saw a text from Laura. She wanted to talk before the meeting. He ignored it and grabbed his briefcase. Inside was everything he needed to bring his plan to fruition. The office was buzzing with nervous energy when he arrived. People followed him as he made his way to his desk. Colleagues cast furtive glances his way. They wanted to know what had happened on Friday night. It was clear that the arrangement had spread to Daniel. He heard a voice call out, turned to see Sarah from accounting, and saw concern etched on her face. He forced a smile and said, "Never better." "Thanks for asking," Sarah replied before she could respond. Mr. Bennett's booming voice cut through the office chatter. "All right, people. Meeting in 5 minutes. Chambers, my office now," he said. Daniel's smile didn't waver as he made his way to Bennett's corner office. His boss was lounging in his chair, looking like the cat that got the cream. "Close the door, Chambers," he said. Bennett told Daniel to sit down and said, "Let's chat." Daniel sat down across from Bennett. "What can I do for you?" Bennett leaned forward and smiled. "I just wanted to thank you for your cooperation this weekend. Laura was really helpful." Daniel's hands were clenched in his lap, but his voice was steady. "I'm glad to hear it. I trust everything went well. A regular arrangement. What do you say, Chambers? Your lovely wife keeps me entertained, and you keep climbing that corporate ladder." Everyone wins for a moment. Daniel allowed himself to imagine leaping across the desk and wiping that smug grin off Bennett's face. Instead, he forced another smile. "Interesting," Bennett said. "Maybe we can discuss the details after the meeting." Bennett's eyebrows shot up. He was clearly surprised by Daniel's apparent eagerness. "Well, looks like you finally learned to play the game," Bennett said. "Chambers, Daniel replied, standing up. "Let's head to the meeting." As they made their way to the conference room, Daniel spotted Laura hovering near the entrance. Her eyes widened when she saw him. Daniel could see a mixture of guilt and hope on her face. "Can we talk, please?" she said, reaching for his arm. Daniel brushed past her without a word, taking his seat at the long table. Laura hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the opposite side, her eyes never leaving him. Bennett took his place at the head of the table, clearing his throat to call the meeting to order. The head of the table cleared his throat to get the meeting started. "All right, people, let's get down to business. The first item on the agenda is actually something I'd like to address first, if you don't mind." Bennett frowned, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Can we talk about this later, Chambers? We have a lot to cover today." "Unfortunately, it can't wait. It's about ethics, you see, corporate ethics to be precise." A ripple of unease swept through the gathered employees. Bennett's frown deepened. "What are you talking about?" Daniel smiled, but it didn't seem friendly. "I'm talking about people abusing their power and using their position to force and manipulate others for personal gain." "Daniel, what are you doing?" Laura hissed from across the table, her face pale. He ignored her instead, addressing the room at large. I'm sure many of you have heard rumors about what happened at the company party last Friday. There was this proposal that Mr. Bennett made about me and my wife. People were shocked and they were murmuring. Bennett's face went from annoyed to alarmed. Chambers, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I suggest you stop right now. Oh, I'm just getting started, Sir Daniel replied, pulling out a small device from his pocket. You see, I have here some very interesting recordings from this weekend. Would you like to hear them before anyone could respond? Daniel pressed play. Bennett's voice, slightly slurred but unmistakable, filled the room. I've had my eye on you for a while now, Laura. Always wondered what you saw in a pushover like Chambers. Laura's voice followed, strained but clear. Daniel's a good man, sure. Exciting, maybe. Bennett's recorded voice scoffed. Does he make you feel alive? Daniel paused the playback, looking around the room. His colleagues sat in stunned silence, some looking horrified, others disgusted. Bennett had gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. There's more, Daniel continued. His voice was cold and detailed, recounting Mr. Bennett's past indiscretions, his methods of controlling employees through manipulation and coercion, and of course, plenty of evidence of what transpired that weekend. You can't do this, Bennett sputtered, finally finding his voice. It's illegal. You had no right to record it, Sir Daniel interrupted. I think you'll find I had every right. The hotel room was booked in my name after all. And as for the legality, well, I'm sure the board of directors and our legal team will have plenty to say about that, not to mention the press. Bennett's face drained of color as the implications sank in. He turned to the others in the room, desperation in his eyes. This is all a setup, he said. He's lying. Daniel could see the doubt on his colleagues' faces. They'd all experienced Bennett's manipulations in one form or another over the years. This was just confirmation of what many had long suspected Daniel. Please, Laura's voice cut through the murmurs, thick with tears. Don't do this. We can work this out for the first time. Daniel turned to face his wife. Work what out, Laura? Your betrayal. Your willingness to sell yourself and our marriage for a shot at a more comfortable life. Laura flinched as if she'd been slapped. It wasn't like that. I did it for us. There is no us anymore, Daniel replied, his voice emotionless. In fact, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. I took the liberty of having these drawn up over the weekend. He slid the envelope across the table to Laura. She opened it with shaking hands and her eyes widened as she realized what she was looking at. Divorce papers. She gasped. Daniel nodded. I think it's best for everyone if we make a clean break, don't you? Laura stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Over the next few days, Daniel gathered his things and left the room. He looked back at Bennett and said, I quit. Bennett shouted, Laura! And Laura was crying. Colleagues were arguing amongst themselves. But Daniel didn't look back. He stepped into the elevator, and he realized he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't even realized he'd had on his shoulders. The doors closed, and he was back in the pandemonium he'd left behind. For the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself a genuine smile. The aftermath of Daniel's revelation was swift and far-reaching. By the end of the day, Bennett had been escorted from the building and placed on immediate administrative leave, while the board of directors conducted a full investigation. Daniel's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages from shocked colleagues, reporters seeking comment, and Laura begging for another chance. He ignored them all and focused on the road ahead. Instead of facing the road ahead, Daniel drove out of the city and booked a small cabin by the lake. He wanted to decompress and figure out his next move, watching the sun set over the water that evening. Daniel reflected on the events that had led him there. He felt empty. The rage that had fueled him for the past few days had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow ache. He'd gotten his revenge and exposed the truth. But at what cost? His marriage was over. Over his career, at least in this city, he'd probably burned bridges that could never be rebuilt. But as he sat there watching the last rays of sunlight dance across the lake, Daniel realized something for the first time in years. He felt free from the crushing weight of others' expectations and the constant struggle to climb the corporate ladder that was rigged from the start. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't look at the caller. Daniel powered it off and tossed it aside. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them on his own terms. As night fell, Daniel stood up and stretched his muscles. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to finding out the cost of betrayal had been high, but the price of reclaiming his life had been worth it.